Most people imagine the time of Jesus as a purely spiritual world. Sandals on dusty roads, sermons on hillsides, miracles, parables, morality tales unfolding in a distant religious past. But for the people who actually lived there, daily life was not shaped by theology. It was shaped by money, or more accurately, by the constant lack of it. The world into which the historical figure of Jesus was born was defined by one of the most unequal economic systems the ancient Mediterranean had ever known. Welcome to its financial history too. Beneath the faith, a world where money, power, and belief collide, and where nothing is ever as simple as it appears. At the beginning of the 1st century, Judea existed inside the Roman Empire, the most efficient extraction machine the ancient world had ever built. Rome did not conquer territories to integrate them. It conquered them to fund the center. Provinces existed to move wealth outward, grain, silver, labor, flowing from the edges of the empire toward Rome itself. Judea was one of those edges. And this mattered deeply because Judea was not rich. It was overwhelmingly rural, agricultural, and fragile. Most people lived off small plots of land, not farms in the modern sense, but just enough soil to survive. A bad harvest didn't mean lower profits. It meant hunger. And Rome did not care. Rome governed Judea through a blend of imperial officials and local elites. Kings like Herod the Great ruled with Roman approval. After his death, Roman prefects, including Pontius Pilate, took direct control. Their mandate was simple: maintain order and ensure revenue flowed without interruption. Improving living standards was never part of the job. Taxes were the backbone of the system, and this is where modern assumptions fall apart. Today, we think of taxes as something paid on income or profit. In Judea, taxes were owed simply because you existed. Land taxes, produce taxes, head taxes, tolls on roads and markets. Religious taxes layered on top of imperial ones. Miss a payment, and consequences were immediate. There was no appeals process, no safety net. Tax collection was outsourced to local contractors, tax farmers, who paid Rome upfront for the right to collect. Whatever they extracted beyond that was profit. Abuse wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the incentive. If you couldn't pay, you borrowed. Debt was everywhere. And unlike modern debt, there were no release valves. No bankruptcy. No restructuring. Interest accumulated quickly. Land was collateral. One bad year could push a family into a spiral they would never escape. The pattern was brutal and common. A farmer plants his crops. Weather turns. Harvest fails. Taxes remain due. He borrows from a wealthy landowner or a lender connected to temple elites. Interest compounds. The next year barely recovers. Debt remains. Eventually the land is seized. The farmer becomes a tenant on his own former property, or worse, disappears into day labor or servitude. This wasn't accidental. It was structural. Over time, land consolidated into fewer hands. Large estates replaced small plots. Wealth clustered around elites tied to Roman authority and temple administration. The majority slid into precarity. The economy didn't just produce poverty, it reproduced it. And there was no state support, no unemployment, no welfare, no public housing. Family was the only buffer. Community charity existed, but it couldn't absorb systemic pressure. When too many people fell at once, the system offered nothing. Debt wasn't only financial, it was social. Losing land meant losing status, identity, and future security. A drought, a tax increase, or a single unpaid obligation could erase generations of stability overnight. This is the world Jesus was born into. And it's important to be clear, most people were not poor because they were lazy, immoral, or cursed. They were poor because the system required them to be. Rome needed surplus. Local elites needed rent. The temple needed revenue. All that pressure settled on people with the least margin for error. The result was tension. Judea was not calm. It was volatile. Rebellions flared constantly. Banditry wasn't just crime, it was economic desperation. Messianic movements didn't emerge in comfort. They emerged in collapse. This is where modern readers often miss the point. When people heard teachings about forgiveness, release, and justice, they weren't hearing metaphors. They were hearing survival. Forgiveness didn't just mean emotional relief. It meant debt cancellation. It meant escape. And escape was rare. By the time Jesus began speaking publicly, the pressure was unbearable. The audience was primed. The anger was real. The desperation was rational. This wasn't background. It was the engine. To understand how trapped people felt, you have to look at the institution meant to protect them, the temple. Today, the Jerusalem temple is imagined as purely religious: prayer, sacrifice, spiritual authority. But economically, it was one of the most powerful institutions in the region. It functioned as a treasury, a bank, a tax authority, and a court, all at once. Every adult Jewish male owed an annual temple tax. It was mandatory, and it had to be paid in a specific silver coin, the Tyrian shekel. Roman coins weren't accepted. Local currencies weren't accepted. Money changers handled the exchange for a fee. Vendors sold sacrificial animals at temple-approved prices. If you were poor, you paid less, but you still paid. Religion didn't replace Roman taxation. It stacked on top of it. And the temple elite were deeply entangled with Roman power. High priests were appointed with Roman approval. Stability mattered more than righteousness. Cooperation mattered more than justice. So the institution that claimed moral authority also benefited from the same extraction that impoverished the people. This contradiction did not go unnoticed. Resentment grew, not against faith but against hypocrisy. When Jesus spoke about debt forgiveness, people heard economics. When he spoke about the poor, they heard themselves. When he spoke about the kingdom of God, they didn't hear abstraction, they heard an alternative order. And then came the act that changed everything. When Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers, this wasn't just religious anger. It was economic confrontation. He wasn't attacking prayer. He was attacking the monetization of access to the sacred. He called it a den of robbers, not because money existed, but because extraction had replaced justice. This crossed a line. Rome tolerated profits. It tolerated criticism. What it could not tolerate was instability. Especially during Passover, when crowds filled Jerusalem and rebellion was always one spark away. From the perspective of authorities, Jesus wasn't just preaching. He was disrupting flows. He was undermining legitimacy, and that was dangerous. The conflict wasn't primarily theological, it was economic and political. Empires can tolerate suffering. They cannot tolerate narratives that make suffering feel unnecessary. Within a generation, Judea exploded into revolt. In 70 CE, Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was dismantled stone by stone, its treasury looted, its priesthood erased. Rome crushed resistance and intensified extraction. But while Rome won militarily, it never fully regained control of meaning. Jesus had not offered a new tax policy or a rival state. He challenged something deeper, the moral logic that made extraction feel inevitable and divinely justified. By treating poverty as structural rather than moral, by offering forgiveness without payment, by centering the poor instead of blaming them, he destabilized the story's power depended on. After the temple fell, small communities emerged with different assumptions, shared resources, mutual aid, debt relief, loyalty based on belief rather than land or status. These weren't revolutions. They were parallel systems, moral alternatives inside the empire. Rome crushed armies easily. But this kind of challenge moved with people. It survived loss. It endured pressure. And eventually, Rome absorbed it. By the 4th century, the empire conceded something crucial. Authority could no longer rest on force alone. Moral credibility mattered. The economy of Jesus' time teaches an uncomfortable truth. Systems don't collapse simply because they're unjust. They collapse when the stories that justify them stop working. Rome perfected extraction. But it never repaired the moral fracture beneath it. And once people stopped believing suffering was necessary, deserved, or sacred, power began to erode. History doesn't repeat, but it reveals patterns. And once you learn how power protects itself, not just with force, but with stories, those stories are never quite as convincing again. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History has answers. I'll show you where to look.